market growth will be slower in the future and could stop altogether. The RBA says the low inflation-driven boom of the late 90s and the early 2000s has now ended. The bank says that means much slower and patchier house price growth than in the period before the global financial crisis. The RBA says there will be more periods when house prices are falling and has warned against taking out large loans that could end up being bigger than the value of the home. Well, for more on this, I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Nigel Stapledon. He's the Associate Head of Economics at the University of New South Wales. Nigel Stapledon, thanks very much for coming in. When a Reserve Bank official speaks like this and issues a warning like the one that's been made, how carefully should we listen?
Well, the Reserve Bank does a lot of in-depth research on these issues, so I would certainly give some weight to their opinion on house prices.
And essentially what we're hearing is that there's not likely to be another housing boom anytime soon?
I think that's the basic message, and it's a message I would essentially endorse.
Why? What are the factors that are going to cause that?
Well, Australia's been pretty lucky on the housing front in recent years. In the US, we saw a major correction downward in house prices. Australia missed out on that. And a lot of that's to do with the resources boom. So if you go back in the early 2000s, house prices in Australia were probably at least as overvalued as they were in the US, whereas the correction in the US happened via a sharp fall in prices. Here it's actually happened via a significant uptrend in rents. So that's corrected the sort of misalignment in the house price. And that significant rise in rents very much aligned to the resources boom. Now, as we know, the Treasurer is having trouble balancing the books because with the resources boom coming off, revenues are getting a bit tighter, and the same thing is sort of going to be happening to household incomes and hence a slowing also in rental growth.
Okay, the rationale, as I'm attempting to understand it, is that because inflation was low in the 90s and the early part of this century, interest rates remained low, and low interest rates meant people could afford to borrow a lot more, which meant they could bid a lot more for the house they wanted, and prices rose. That's now tapered off.
That's correct. So that was, I think the Reserve Bank's talking about that as a one-off structural rise in house prices in response to a sort of one-off structural decline in interest rates, which came with the return of inflation from high levels to low levels. And that was a very similar story to the US and a lot of other countries. So we had a very common story with them, but the story since that boom has been somewhat different. So in a sense, we need to understand that we're a little bit lucky.
Okay, but what is likely to be the consequences of this? Because for a lot of Australians, it's been that growth in the value of the family home, which has been the major driver of household wealth.
Well, it has, and I've enjoyed that. Most of my generation has enjoyed that. On the other hand, that significant rise in price has meant lower affordability. So it means that house prices are expensive for the next generation, my kids, your kids, to get into the housing market. So it's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it's increasing my wealth. On the other hand, it's making it much more expensive for the next generation to get into the market.
So the bad news for anybody trying to buy into the market now is that prices may still be a little bit ahead of perhaps where they should be or where they will be in the future. But you're not likely to see much profit generated from buying into the market now in terms of what you might receive for it when you sell in the future.
Well, it is difficult to see the sort of capital gains that have been experienced in the last sort of 20 years being repeated in the next 20. We had significant capital price appreciation up until the mid-2000s with very little movement in rents. We've now had a correction up in rents. So unless we're talking about
this current environment?
I think so. Essentially, the notion that inflation is going to come along and reduce the value of your debt, that's very much a thing of the past. I think most Australians sort of understand that, so they are being a bit more cautious about taking on debt. But the notion that if you borrow to the hilt now, in 10 years' time, the value of your property will have gone up substantially and will have given you a huge increase in equity, I think people need to be very cautious about that. I think we're going back to a period a bit like the 60s, where when people took out a mortgage, it's going to take a significant part of their working life to repay that mortgage. And hence, people do need to be a little bit more cautious about the degree of leverage they take on housing.
And housing is much more affordable in a lot of other places. Are house prices artificially high in this country because of the tax regime around buying a home, the family home, and negative gearing and so on?
I'm not sure it's the tax. The Reserve Bank actually looked at that about 10 years ago in a paper and actually found that wasn't such a significant factor. I think they more highlighted, there's a lot of differences about the Australian market. Most of our cities are coastal, which means there's an attraction to living near the beach and the like. We do also tend to have supply constraints, both in terms of restrictions on inner city development, so with zoning and the like, and also there's been a lot of constraints in the outer suburban areas in terms of. So we've tended to have a fairly supply constrained market, and so when you get shifts in demand, it tends to quickly translate into prices.
Okay, Dr. Nigel Stapledon, thanks very much for coming in and talking to us here on Afternoon Live.
That's a pleasure.